Well, good evening, everybody. My name is Patrick Spiro, and I'm the librarian at the American Philosophical Society. And it is my privilege to welcome you all here to the keynote for a conference that is going to take place in the next couple of days. I hope you all enjoy tonight's conversation, but I promise it is just a taste of what's to come over the course of tomorrow and Saturday. So thank you for attending this lecture, and really, if you're free on Friday or Saturday, please consider popping in for the rest of the proceedings. It is now my real honor to introduce tonight Barbara Oberg. Barbara is the chair of the Library and Museum Committee. She's the former editor of the Benjamin Franklin Papers and the Thomas Jefferson Papers. So think about the knowledge she has of these two great founders, both of our country, but instrumental individuals in the history of the American Philosophical Society. Barbara is a longtime member of the APS, and she also is a longtime friend and colleague of tonight's speaker, Billy Smith. And so she is going to introduce tonight's speaker and I think provide a little bit more insight on who Billy is.
Introduce this person, who is my husband. We've only been married 37 years, so we're not sure if it'll last, but I bring him places with me. And I will also just tell you a quick anecdote about Franklin and Jefferson. I don't know whether many of you remember Ralph Archbold, who used to play Franklin here in Philadelphia. When he heard that I was leaving the Franklin Papers at Yale to come here and to come to Princeton, work on Thomas Jefferson, he stood up straight as he ran into me on the street in his full Franklin regalia and said, "You are leaving me for a red-headed younger man from Virginia." He said he would never forgive me. Anyway, it's my great pleasure to help kick off the APS Library and Museum Conference on the power of maps and the politics of borders. The conference was inspired by the current APS Museum exhibition, Mapping a Nation, Shaping the Early American Republic, that traces the creation and use of maps from the mid-18th century through 1816. The exhibition brings together materials from the APS collections and investigates maps as both artworks and practical tools that have political and social meaning. It features historical maps, surveying instruments, books, manuscripts, and other objects to show how maps were used to create and extend the physical, political, and ideological boundaries of the new nation. And Billy's going to explain what all that means, while at the same time creating and reinforcing structural inequalities. I think you should really make sure to get over and see this exhibition. It's open Thursdays through Sundays from 10 until 5. The conference papers explore the same themes and reflect on the core collecting areas represented in the APS Library and Museum's holdings. While the conference itself is framed around the history of early America, it also features papers on the history of science and technology, as well as the history of indigenous cultures throughout the Americas. For tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Billy G. Smith, who said I was allowed to introduce him if I only said nice things about him. Billy is professor of history and distinguished professor of letters and science at Montana State University, where he teaches, researches, writes about early America. He's published 9 books. I think that was enough to get you tenure, wasn't it? And dozens of articles, edited a journal, and organized conferences. About a decade ago, he was seduced, that's his word, by the geographic turn in history, and he organized a team of scholars and students to map Philadelphia during the 1790s. This project became Mapping Historic Philadelphia, Recreating Life in America's First City, which uses GIS. Now, you will all know, I'm sure, that stands for Geographic Information System Mapping Technology. I had to look it up. Billy will talk about his contributions to the geographic turn tonight in his talk titled Ona Judge Staines and Martha Washington, Mapping Inequality, Resistance, and Solutions in Early National Philadelphia. He'll share with us the story of Ona Judge Staines, an enslaved young woman serving as personal servant to Martha Washington. She escaped from the president's mansion in Philadelphia and boarded a ship bound for New Hampshire in search of freedom. Billy will use mapping to explore the lived realities of inequality, resistance, and their possible solutions in Philadelphia during the early national period. The thing I really have to say about him, he's smart, and he's clever, and he is the funniest person you'll ever meet.
Great. Thank you very much, Barbara. You could have said many worse things about me. I appreciate it that you didn't, since you know me relatively well. I'm really happy to be here. This is just a great room. I've never been asked to speak in it before, but I've come here on many occasions attending quite distinguished lectures, and therefore it scares me just a little bit to be here too. Partly also because I just admire Benjamin Franklin so much, always have. Of course, this is his hall. And always have admired the APS. I'll say a few more words about that in just a second. Another reason I'm so happy to be here is because I love Philadelphia. Even though I've lived in Montana for 40 years, I just love Philadelphia. My wife has been here for a couple of days now, and we have just walked the streets of Philadelphia continually. It's one of the things I've always liked about Philadelphia, because I can, especially after being a scholar for such a long time of Philadelphia, I can live both in my own era and also feel like I live in the 18th century. And it's part of that feeling that I want to try to convey a little bit tonight with this mapping project of Philadelphia, is how can we walk the streets and feel life there, feel inequalities there, unfortunately, but also feel, although I might not have as much time for this, but also feel some of the ways in which they are extremely optimistic in the 1790s and the new nation, that they can solve these kinds of problems, whether it's race or class or gender or wealth inequality, exactly the same kind of problems that we deal with today, but in a much more optimistic sense. And that's one of the things I admire about these Philadelphians too, and think that we can find some inspiration in our own times in which many of us have just thrown up our hands and given up, perhaps, or at least have thought about that. But that these people are not doing that. So what I want to do is to use Ona Judge, as Barbara has already said, a slave of Martha Washington, and take a brief walk around Philadelphia, highlighting just a few of the people who are living where they would have walked by, and highlighting some of the issues that are associated with that. And in that way, try to bring this alive in some sense. Let me get the technology going here. The other thing I did want to say is about the American Philosophical Society, my admiration for it. I first came here about 107 years ago when I was a beginning graduate student, truly mid-1970s from UCLA, came here, had never been to Philadelphia, had never been in an archives, and I was so warmly taken in by the staff who were here, welcomed, taught how to do research, told about the records, and just felt that I belonged here in lots of ways. Also with all the, the bus of people around, and also, Benjamin Franklin, all of them and these images around, I really felt like a scholar. And it was the beginning of my own passion for research, which has continued for 40 years, not just about Philadelphia, about early America, but just doing research too. Just enjoying living in the records and even being able to transport myself in some ways there. Also, I just want to once again call your attention to the Mapping a Nation Shaping the Early American Republic exhibit that's here. There is one of the maps of Philadelphia that Eric Holmes shared with me. She calls it the Eastburn map, although she also assured me, kind of enigmatically, but has nothing to do whatsoever with Benjamin Eastburn. So it might be worth a look in just to find that and other stories as you are here, as well as, of course, the conference itself. Let me start with one of the maps. I've produced maybe 500 maps, perhaps, out of this project so far. Fortunately, you're only going to have to see 450 of them tonight. And so I would just survey the maps a little bit to talk about the kinds of things that I think mapping Philadelphia using sort of the bells and whistles of GIS, and also the maps themselves, the antique maps themselves, especially one in particular, and how we can put that together to understand the various parts of Philadelphia life, but also inequalities as well. This map is one of the ones that I'm most proud of, in part because it now is in the newer Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. They asked for it after I had produced this, and that is a map, as you can see here, of free African American householders in Philadelphia. Most of these kinds of maps I will show you tonight, these dots represent individual households. Just so you have some idea about that. And this is the way in which then these free African-American householders were able to arrange themselves. Now, they didn't have freedom of action to do that. There were lots of people who wouldn't rent to them, but there were lots of people who would support them. Lots of white people in the 1790s, once again, who were inspired by the ideals of the American Revolution and wanted to support this growing free African-American population. Now, where do these people come from? Because Philadelphia from about 1790 has about 2,000 free African Americans, about 300 slaves. And by 1800, it's grown to about 6,000. It's grown about 3 times, much faster than the rate of growth for white people. But the way in which they are making their way to Philadelphia and making their way to freedom is to take advantage of the new ideology that's coming out of the American Revolution, but also the new opportunities that's happening both during the American Revolution and thereafter. As many of you might know, at least who know early America, African Americans take advantage of the war itself to fight on both sides, primarily for the British, because they're the ones who first and for the longest period of time will promise that they can get freedom if they fight for the British, but also for the Continental Army in many instances too, who make similar promises but take a lot longer to get to that later in the war itself. Also, a number of African Americans run away during the turmoil of the war. This is a golden opportunity for many of them to try and make a break for freedom. Ona Judge, as we will talk about in a bit, is not old enough to do that, but she does make a break for freedom in the 1790s, as do lots of runaway slaves, a topic that I have investigated for a good part of my career as well. This map, one of the ways in which I read it anyway, is we can see where these households are gathering together let's see if oh, good. Do I have my pointer here? Maybe it's not showing up, but which is too bad. Can I? Nope. So is there some way I can show a pointer here that will show up there? All right, well, it's like magic. Damn, thank you very much. All right, so we see that, there's a group of African-American householders who are right around here. There's a group of African-American householders right up here, which is actually just, I guess, a block or two away from where we're going to focus the president's house in a few minutes. And in the 1790s, Absalom Jones and also Richard Allen are two of the prominent leaders of the African-American community, together with a number of other people, including at least a few women, many of whose name we don't even know, but at least Anne Seville, we do know her name, get together to found self-help groups, educational groups, occupational groups to help one another out. They are realizing that they're in a unique situation here. As well, many of them are very Christian and dedicated to the Christian religion, including Absalom Jones and Richard Allen here. And they are able to found the first free African-American churches in Philadelphia, starting both in 1794 and then about a decade later or so. One of the things I think we can tell from this map is that, by the way, this was is where they found their churches. The first church they found is right next to this group of householders. And then over the next decade, if I were to show you the map from 1801, I'll try not to show every map I've got, is that then the community itself moves around this area of where the church is. Also, the African-American householders are going to be starting to establish themselves out here for a variety of reasons. One is they're a little more separated from the rest of the city. This is about 5th, 6th Street. Hard to imagine nowadays, but this is not a very occupied area at that point. So it's a little separated from the white community. It's also a place where some key roads come in. So when African-Americans do run away, literally following the roads, and end up in Philadelphia, they can establish households out here that they can hide these people in, and which becomes quite a refuge over the next 70 years, actually, for African Americans who are escaping from various parts in the South. Did I want to say other things about this? But we'll probably come back to it later as well. But just to give you an idea of the kind of maps in this format I'm able to create. Now, how are we able to do this? And I want to once again say this took a team effort to do this. It's a lot of work in the way in which we need to put these together. First is using a lot of traditional sources, censuses, tax lists, city directories. Philadelphia is a unique place in the 1790s for a variety of reasons, but one is the kind of records that they produce. To my knowledge, Philadelphia in the 1790s has the largest cache of records of this sort, and accurate records of this sort, anywhere in the Western world in any case. And I'm proud to say that I believe that my team and I have been able to produce these kinds of maps for the earliest city, again, in the Western world, just because we have this concatenation of records that we can trust. Among the records we can trust, and this gets to the subject, of course, both of this conference and also of the exhibit, is one particular map, one made by John Hills of Philadelphia, 1796, 1797. I was alerted to this map by Martin Bruckner, who may or may not be here tonight, but he's presenting at the conference. He and I were fellows at the Library Company about a decade ago. He knows as much about early American maps, written great books on them, as anybody in the world. And he nudged me one time when we were in the library and said, why don't you go out and check this map out? Because I believe we might have something that you might be able to use here that you can trust and is accurate. So we got this map together, got my GIS team together, and they lay down what are called modern street center lines. And it looks like this. Once you lay them down, I think, oh, I see now. It looks like this still now. Here we go. Here's what it looks like, kind of. When you lay down these center lines in the middle of the streets, they almost exactly, the modern city center lines almost lay down exactly, perfectly on this map, giving us a lot of confidence that we could use this. Now, it doesn't mean that everything is exactly accurate on the map, but 95% we're sure of that this is a map that we can trust in any case. And we went forward with this once we could discover this and find it out. By the way, just so you know, you are here. So here we are at the APS, right? And just very near us here, well, I don't think I have to tell you this, is Independence Hall and, the President's House and things of that sort. But just so you're located yourself as to where we are. So Ona and Martha. Ona was born in Mount Vernon, 1773. So when she is brought by the Washingtons to Philadelphia, in 1790 as the personal servant to Martha, and an expert seamstress, does just about everything that Martha wants and needs, of course. She's 17 years old, 1790. Her mother was a slave of the Washingtons. Her father was a white indentured servant, more likely than not. It's hard to know exactly, but that seems to be the case. So she's of mixed race. And Martha identifies her as somebody that she wants to make her personal servant. Well back in Mount Vernon, brings her to New York City first, because remember, the capital's in New York City for a year before it moves to Philadelphia. And so they're living together in the same house here, of course, in much different quarters in that house. The slaves and servants live in the back, and also even outside the house, in the stables, things of that sort. Anybody that's been down to the president's house can see that visually when you're there. And if you haven't been there, it's well worth walking down to see that. So I want to walk with Martha and also with Ona around the city, just a few blocks in any case, and highlight some of the people who live there, and then so we can put those give it a personal feel for when we move on to talking more about these kinds of maps and analyzing that situation for both of them, and how they might see things as they walked around. So the trip that I'm imagining here, probably around 1794, and again, this is a fictional trip, may well have happened. At some points, I'm sure they covered the same ground together. But is a trip from the president's house down to the museum, Charles Wilson Peale's museum. Peale founded this museum in 1786, not the very first museum, but certainly the most important in early America. And one of the reasons I'm also having them walk there is because just about this time, Charles Wilson Peale is moving his museum up to the APS here, the American Philosophical Society. And for the next 20 years or so, they're going to be occupying space, as I understand it anyway, in Independence Hall as well. So there's a real connection here to the American Philosophical Society. Also, Charles Wilson Peale's a great painter. He paints Martha Washington. He paints George Washington. They certainly know each other. We have records that both George and Martha had gone to this museum before. And so it seems appropriate to me to try and walk them down there. And we'll walk, just a very brief walk eastward on High Street or Market Street, same thing, it changes the name slightly, and then turn south on 3rd and walk down to Lombard. So those Philadelphians locally would certainly know that here in this room pretty easily in any case. Martha would, of course, get in a carriage. This is a recreation of a carriage from Mount Vernon. It's much too large to have been one of their carriages when they were up here. They had 3 or 4 carriages, however, because if you are of Martha's status or George's status, you don't walk on the streets, frankly. You get in a carriage. You have slaves riding both before and aft. But Ona wouldn't have been one of those. Those would have been males who had been before and aft. So I'm putting Ona outside the carriage, but first we shall put, actually, Martha into the carriage and have Ona walking afterwards. Now, why don't you walk the streets? Well, partly because the streets are really ugly, with offal, with horses, pigs, cows. This is not a pleasant place to be walking. And so not only do you want to show your status like Martha would here and the inequality, but also you want to demonstrate, or you don't want to get your feet muddy, quite frankly, in all of this. So if they begin their walk toward 3rd Street, and so they're going eastward on Market, there are 3 market houses there, which they come to within a block. These are images by William Birch, made a series of engravings in 1798, which in many ways gives us our best view of what Philadelphia actually looked like. And this is a view of the marketplace itself, when obviously uncrowded view of the marketplace itself. And here's another quite delightful view that's shown often. I've used it in my classes too, but shown often of what does an early city look like here? What does Philadelphia look like? Now, quite frankly, these looks great, right? It looks like a great place to have lived, and a great place, an idealized, however, version is what William Birch is giving us. The reality, however, is completely different. This is one of the things that actually startled me a decade ago when we first started to be able to turn out some maps. These are the householders who live in Philadelphia in 1790, 1791. Each dot represents a household. You can see they are stacked on top of one another, literally stacked, because people are living in 3 stories, but 2 or 3 different households in many cases are living in 3 stories. So this is, what one should think of it is maybe New York City, perhaps, at 5 o'clock down at, on 42nd Street or something like that. I mean, if you're going to walk the streets here, there are people everywhere all the time. It's also an 18th century city, so it means that people are outside all the time. Almost anybody who can get out of their small quarters are going outside, going to taverns, hanging around outside. So we've got incredibly crowded streets, much different than what we just saw in the William Bingham engraving there, as beautiful as they are, but not very realistic. So they walk by the market, stumble over a lot of shit, at least unfortunately probably for Ona in any case, turn south on 3rd Street, and within a block or 2, they would pass by a woman's house, Susannah Cook. She's a free black washerwoman in Philadelphia at this point. She's just endured an incredible tragedy. The year before, 1793, there's a yellow fever epidemic that kills about 10% of the population of Philadelphians, which is just an amazing number when you think of it. 5,000 people, perhaps, out of a city of 50,000. Susannah Cook loses both her husband and her son to that. She has 2 more daughters, and she continues to try and piece things together for the next few years. To do that, she has to take in boarders, and she also has to begin to do one of the few occupations where women can make any kind of money, and that is washing clothes. An incredibly difficult thing to do. Very hard work and ill-paid. And so she's trying to put this together and put her life together and keep her family together in this way. By the way, along that block, there are lots and lots of widows right along here, in part because this is Dock Creek at the time, which is kind of a creek that doesn't flow, but it's still full of sludge. Lots of mosquitoes. Yellow fever is created and caused by these mosquitoes, and so it becomes an area of very high mortality. So we've got lots and lots of widows who are living along this street, not just poor, but wealthier widows too. But what it means is women have to begin to cope with what What do we do now in a society which is so incredibly structured against women making a living? It's almost impossible to make a living whether you're a washerwoman or even if you're a shopkeeper or if you're a spinner. We'll talk about their issues perhaps a little bit later. So she's facing this kind of dilemma. It's the kind of woman, now we don't know that Ona did know her or not, but it's the kind of woman that certainly Ona was aware of, because many of the washerwomen in Philadelphia at this point are black, whether they're slave or free. And so it's the kind of woman that probably as, Ona walked by and glanced over perhaps at the house, she wouldn't be surprised to see this. And in fact, we do have some image here, at least one that would recreate. This is not exactly, once again, I want to make certain to say, we don't know exactly what Susannah Cook's house looked like, but this is an image taken of a place in the 1930s, which matches the dimensions. I do know the dimensions of her house. It's 2 stories, 12 feet by 27 feet, 6 people living in there. Ona, her 2 daughters, and then 3 boarders who were living upstairs. That's that kind of stacking quality of people on top of one another, if you're at all a laboring person. Within a half a block of that, though, is the mansion of William and Ann Bingham. It's an entire block long, almost, in Philadelphia. Has huge gardens behind it. William Bingham's one of the richest men in America at that point. And so within, half a block of one another, walking down this street, both Ona and Martha would see the stark differences here. Would Martha notice, Susannah Cook's house or Susannah Cook? Probably not, because we know that wealth often blinds people to inequalities of other people. And especially in this case, well, I won't go beyond that. But it's for certain that Martha did know Ann Bingham. Ann Bingham, along with Elizabeth Peale, who also lived in a quite fabulous mansion. It's still there today, actually, you can tour it. Next to them. Am I here? Am I there? No, there I am. Ooh, there we go. Well, going the other way. There we go. So Ann Bingham is having salons, just like Martha Washington is having salons every Saturday as the president's wife with lots of invited people, some like Ann Bingham, who would be coming over. Now, Ona's position, of course, would probably be that she would recognize Ann Bingham because she probably had waited on her at some point when Martha had invited her over for one of these salons. Martha would have clearly known Ann Bingham, probably not been that impressed even by this mansion coming from the kinds of background that she did, which is a very wealthy background, of course. In the next block or so, wow, it's almost like I can hear Philadelphia, isn't it? Actually, interestingly, if we were to think about the sounds of Philadelphia at the time, it would have been incredibly loud. Not only is there lots of people, horses, construction going on because the city is growing so fast, hammering everywhere. So this is not going to be a silent city. Philadelphia is not a silent city today either, but it would have different kinds of noise background for us to think about in any cases. Horses being one of them, of course. Horses are going to be everywhere on the streets here. Within the next block, they would go by, both Martha and Ona, the house of a manager of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. Perhaps neither of them knew this person, and I won't even give his name, it doesn't matter that much, but to say that, this Pennsylvania Abolition Society and this particular gentleman certainly had an impact on Martha and Ona's lives, whether they knew him personally or not. And that is, the Pennsylvania Abolition Society was, to a great deal, responsible for passing laws in Pennsylvania in 1780 and 1788, which gradually emancipated slaves, ended slavery gradually. didn't by any means let slaves go free right away. But slavery is being phased out in Pennsylvania then by the time that the Washingtons show up in 1790. An important component of this law is that if you bring a slave into Pennsylvania and you keep that slave for more than 6 months, that slave has a right to sue for freedom and to become free. This is a problem for George and Martha. When they realize this fairly early on, they're alerted to it when they're coming to Philadelphia. Very clearly, George instructs Martha to actually make certain to rotate the slaves out of Philadelphia every 6 months. Move them out to another state, even if it's only for 2 days, and then you can move them back in to make certain that they can't legally claim their freedom. He wants this done surreptitiously. He's very clear about that, and it is done that way. And we have several records of Martha taking Ona Judge just up to Trenton for a couple of days every 6 months, maybe sending him back to Mount Vernon for 2 weeks, bringing him back. So it's a real, not just an attempt to evade the law of the state, but an outright plot here by both of them to do that. It's not unusual for a number of other slave owners who are also federal officers here and living in the city to use this means to keep their slaves enslaved. The next block or so, they would go by the house of Absalom Jones, who we've already pointed out. He's one of the ministers here, one of the founders of the Free African American Society. And once again, it seems nearly impossible to think that Ona Judge would not have been aware of him, even if she didn't know him. And this is a small community. This is a community which is obsessed with the idea of freedom, and rightfully so, the possibilities of gaining freedom, sharing knowledge with one another, living on top of one another, talking to each other, meeting at the marketplace. There's all kinds of places in which people can and do talk to one another. It's very clear. Inform one another about this. It's very possible that Absalom Jones or Richard Allen or some of the others, as we will talk about in a few minutes, helped Ona Judge escape as well. My guess is Martha probably knew of him too, might not have liked him very much for the kinds of things that he was engaged in. Finally, as we're moving on down to finally get to Peale's museum, fortunately, Charles Wilson Peale furnished us with an image of his museum here, and also of Lombard Street, as you can see. It's quite interesting that this is one of the very few, probably only a handful, of images of African Americans before 1800, and that Charles Wilson Peale would choose to depict them, put them in there. Certainly these are chimney sweeps that he is depicting here. But for my purposes, although I won't really do that analysis here right now, but I can map everybody who's living back here. We can now turn these things, I can't do it right here, we can turn these things into 3D, turn it around, look at it, walk into this, and track lots of the people who are living on this street. So we have an image that we can connect together very nicely with the map itself and with the people who are living along here. Well, I'll wait for just a second to get to the point I want to make there. All right. We've made this quick walk, pointed out a few of the people who are living along here, some of the issues they're facing, lots of the wealth inequality and other kinds of inequality. In 1796, Ona Judge runs away from the president. You can see the advertisement here. What's this, May 24th? So it's around May 21st. And she leaves an account of running away. No, not an account, but she is interviewed by abolitionist newspapers in the North in the 1840s, so that we have a pretty accurate account in her own words as to how she got away. What she says, it's one Saturday night, the president and his family are sitting down to dinner, and I simply walked out the door. The next thing she is talking about is that she disappears into the black community there. From what we can tell, she probably has disappeared for about a week. She's hidden by the black community, her words exactly. We don't know again. I was hoping desperately, but knowing I wouldn't be able to find who exactly does help her. She doesn't reveal that, just like lots of runaway slaves don't reveal who helps them, because they know, especially if you're the slave of the President of the United States, that those people are going to be punished pretty severely. So she finds some succor and clearly is hidden by the black community for about a week, and then she boards a ship called the Nancy, sails down the Delaware Bay, sails on to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, where she's able to establish herself as a free person. But she's never really quite free. And the reality is that George Washington continues to pursue her for the rest of his life. This is not somebody who gives up. This is not unusual for lots of these slave owners that I've tracked down through the runaway slave ads and things of that sort. Both George and Martha feel that Ona is just incredibly ungrateful, is what they're saying. Their own idea of what she owes them is just appallingly evident. And George himself, and I know this will shock us in today's world, uses the federal government to try and track Ona down for his own personal benefit in this particular case. He contacts some customs officers up in New Hampshire, for example, and they go and interview her, and the customs officer, who's not sympathetic to tracking Ona down, and George, by the way, is doing this surreptitiously once again. He says, don't let anybody know that we're doing this, really. And so the guy interviews, Whipple, I think is his name, interviews Ona, and says, really, all she wants to do is have her complete freedom. That's why she ran away. George and Martha can never understand that. They think, as they say in the advertisement, they think she's been decoyed away by somebody. She's been helped by somebody else here. And that's often the response, especially the response of slave owners of black women running away, because it's just so far beyond their comprehension that it would be a case of wanting to get free that would inspire Ona. But she's always very clear on this, and in the interviews later, 1840s too, says exactly the same thing. I wanted to be free, and that's obviously her declaration. She does manage to be free for the rest of her life, although she has to move several times. George also sends a slave catcher, kidnap her off after her once too. And she's able to avoid that kidnapper, but she's never completely sure whether she's going to be free or not. And thus that book, maybe I had the title up here just a few minutes ago, this great book about Ona Judd that's just come out a couple of years ago about never caught. It means she's not free, she's just never caught, and she realizes that. But she does get married, she has some children, she lives a good long life, 70 years, something like that. She has hardships, there's a lot of poverty. That's true for lots of runaway slaves who have to stay in hiding and also don't have a lot of skills or opportunities, of course, even when they get to freedom. So let me back up for that and return to some of these maps that I've created. And talk, give a little context for some of these things as well. I think I need wine, not water. One of the things I've focused on is in these series of maps, which are available online, and a number of essays that I've done, also a number of more and more I'm writing for journals online, because these are the much better way to display these kinds of things, to be able to show people what you're talking about. Very hard to do that in print. But in terms of some of the things I think we can map the inequalities in terms of gender and race, ethnicity, things of that sort, the kinds of things, once again, that I think are plagues of our society today often. We can see both how we can measure these things and also how people at the time at least respond to it, even if I don't have too much time to talk about the response part. But one of the things I want to talk about here is the growing class segregation in Philadelphia. In 1790, and I'm just using laborers and merchants as a proxy here. Laborers mostly are always, pretty poor people. They're the green ones up here. And the red ones are the merchants, who are not universally wealthy, but certainly almost always wealthier than laborers, so that we can get a pretty quick indication of how merchants are occupying the area along the Delaware River. That's where the business is. That's where the ships are coming and going, things of that sort. Also up Market Street. That's where they have their shops. That's where you sell. That's the elite corridor, as geographers often describe it. And then the laborers are cheaper housing outside the city. You've got to walk into the city for your work, things of that sort. So less desirable. This increases even more in the next decade. And you can see that it become even more isolated during the 1790s. In part, this is because the federal government itself that is here in Philadelphia. When the federal government moves here, it drives up the price of housing enormously. And so that if you are of modest means, it's hardly any way that you're going to be able to live in the middle of the city, even though that's perhaps the most desirable place for many people to live at that point. Quite a bit different. Although I guess Philadelphia's changed back to that in many ways, right? It's fun to see that change in Philadelphia over the decades. So we have class formation that's occurring in Philadelphia, and class formation in specific neighborhoods. Now, maybe this map is not going to show up quite well enough, but what's happening here with lots of other maps I've produced too is that before the American Revolution, often people would live together in craft groups. Shoemakers would live close to one another. Tailors would live close to one another, things of that sort, mostly in the inner city. What's happening though in the 1790s is that lots of poorer people are being pushed out of the city, and so that now we don't just have tailors and tailors and shoemakers living next to one another, but now we have people with lots of different lower class occupational groups moving next to one another. Part of this, I would argue, and I use it as a basis for some of the other materials that I have, means that there's a growing class consciousness on the part of lots of these people. Living next door, a tailor living next door to a laborer, living next door to a board measure here, and people like that means that you get to know somebody else that you might not otherwise have been aware of. And that as the wealth inequalities increase, class segregation increases in the city, it facilitates becoming more aware of your group as a class, a separate class, not just a craft or something of that sort. Also, part of what I want to talk about in regards to this, something that's clearly affecting our society today, has been for a couple of decades, is not industrialization, but deindustrialization, as we know. But what's happening here for lots of people, especially craftspeople, in this case shoemakers, is industrialization and globalization. And that is that machines now, especially in England, are beginning to create products, shoes in particular, that are and yarn and things of that sort, that then imported to America and sold much cheaper than craftspeople can make it. It becomes a real problem for craftspeople. For a long time, they've existed in the Western world for a long time in Philadelphia, and all of a sudden they're reaching a crisis situation because they can no longer compete with these machine-produced goods. There's a huge strike, finally, by shoemakers in 1801, the first national strike in America that occurs. And it's in response to this. Now, this looks really messy, because it is. And I'm not going to try and explain all of it, except to say that I've been able to then locate these, both the shoemakers, the shoe warehouses, the shoe dealers, and put this together to help me understand and explain what this crisis is all about, what this labor organization is all about, and how they're responding to forces beyond their control, trying to bring it back into their control, but ultimately not able to. It's not just because they lose this strike, which they do, but also because this is just the way in which the world is going, as we know, and the machines are displacing craftspeople in all kinds of crafts after this, and it's what's happening, in around 1800 and continuing to happen, as we know. Something similar is happening to washerwomen, for example. It's not just craftsmen who are being pushed out to the edges of the city, or laborers and things like that, but also washerwomen too. In this regard as well, it's not just that they're assuming a different pattern of where they're living. If I had an earlier map of this, you could see that change. But it's also that washerwomen are becoming much more numerous in Philadelphia than they ever had been before. It's connected to spinning, and it's connected to the production of yarn in factories. Spinning used to be a way for many women that they could make a living, not a decent living. They could at least supplement the income of their husbands too. But it was respectable. You could stay home. You could care for your kids. You could try and keep your household together. However, with the ginnies that are brought in here, especially to New England, but also to the mid-Atlantic states, it's undermining that possibility. So for women, what they have to do is find some other means of employment. Much harder work, much less well paid, and they become much more desperate in many cases, as we see as well. So, their response is much tougher than at least the shoemakers can get together, as can other craftsmen. There's other strikes that occur at this time, too, in labor organization. For women, it's just not a real possibility given the structure of the inequality that exists for them. Talk just a little bit about ethnicity, since it's hard to avoid refugees, ethnicity, the hatred of people pouring into the country, supposedly. 1796, something similar is happening in Philadelphia and in the nation. From the U.S. Congress halls, there's a Federalist who is warning against, he's not a lone voice here, the hordes of wild Irishmen who are coming in. The Irish are almost always hated anywhere they go, it seems like. I guess it's the luck of the Irish, I suppose. But in this particular case, the Irish are fleeing desperate situations. In 1790s, uprising against Britain and Ireland, starvation, and many of them are arriving in America as refugees. And many Americans welcome them in. And I don't want to leave the impression they don't. For many Americans, they're welcoming and they're saying, that's the kind of country we are. We're an immigration country, and we should embrace them. The Federalists, however, begin to discern that they are losing votes because the Irish are voting almost universally for the Republicans, that is, the Jeffersonians at that point, not the modern Republican Party or Democratic Republicans. But so these hordes of wild Irishmen, they're warning against, and so I've spent some time trying to reconstruct how do people settle themselves in this city in the 1790s, 1800. Are they able to live side by side, integrate neighborhoods, things of that sort? And my findings chiefly is that's exactly what's happening. Now, this is a slightly different presentation, trying to present this by blocks of where are the Irish, for example, in green, underrepresented in these particular blocks, and where are they in red, overrepresented. Now, we do see that what's then the south of Philadelphia, in any case, south there, and that area down there, is a little bit overrepresented by the Irish. And it does even get the name of Irish Town for a short time. However, the Irish, and again, a number of other maps that I've looked at but won't show you here, the Irish set up lots of their own boarding houses, shops, meeting places, Hibernian taverns, and things of that sort, not in these Irish blocks, but just as well in almost any of these other blocks. These are usually German-dominated blocks, for example, and you'll find lots of their places there. You don't put a shop in the middle of an area if those people aren't going to come to your shop, basically. So I think one way to try and understand how do people engage with one another on an everyday basis is at least this gives us a window into that world. And my argument is, and will be, that people do and can live together regardless of the idiots in Congress who are trying to scare the hell out of people. The Federalists, by the way, go on to pass what's called the Alien Act in 1798. Which tries to keep the Irish out, and for the Irish who get in, it takes 17 years to actually become a citizen and to be able to vote. The fortunate good story, and maybe this is heartful for our own times as well, is that in 1800, once Jefferson gets in, they just let that law die, basically, and it's not brought back. But we can see lots of parallels to Federalists saying we can't let these people vote. We're going to lose the elections if we allow them to do that. I want to, in this kind of heartening vein, I guess, idealistic vein in some ways, point out a neighborhood which is much more integrated in the part of Philadelphia where actually this is where Ona catches the Nancy, this part of Philadelphia, Ray Street here, you can see Market Street, a very integrated neighborhood. Lots of multicultural people, not just living together, married together, intermarried. Lots of African Americans and whites who one might not expect would be living with one another in the same household, married to one another, are occupying this neighborhood. In some ways, I find this very heartening. These are people who clearly can live together and clearly can coexist with one another. I can't say they absolutely find happiness, but it is the case that they are not taken in by this anti-immigrant feeling of the Congress. Let me see. I may be let me just skip ahead one or two and wrap this up and see if we've got some questions then. So my final slide here is just to return to the importance of maps. Obviously, that's what this conference is about. I'm using maps in a somewhat different way because I'm using them as the basis for how do I understand, see Philadelphia in a daily life, but also how can I understand inequalities, measure them better, and see how people respond to these kind of things. So, with that said, thank you very much.
I think we have time for a few questions. Yes, the gentleman in the middle. And Mike, there's somebody by the pool over there.
Relative to Ona Judge's escape from presidential mansion,
Yes.
why would she not have considered at least staying for the 6 months with black families hidden rather than just leaving town?
It's a great point. I think, though, that what she knew is that Washington was too powerful, frankly. And so even if she would have made it for the entire 6 months, that the Pennsylvania Abolition Society would argue for her, would put forward lawyers and things of that sort. But boy, when you're facing the President of the United States, as we see in our own times, it can cow a lot of people. And so I think that might be one of the answers, but perhaps there's another suggestion right here in front. Oh, I'm sorry.
Adriana,
Sorry.
So I thought your talk was very, very interesting. When you presented the demographic with Irish folks,
Right.
I was curious as to how that would look if you did it by religion as opposed to ethnicity. Certainly
It would look
the
different.
Germans...
What I imagined... Well, no, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, sir, I would imagine the Germans that were interspersed with the Irish would have been Protestants as opposed to Catholics.
Yes. No, and certainly it would look quite a bit different. And I have to rely on this form of identifying ethnicity, but I can't really do religion because I can't track them down in the same way. Yes, we have roles of churches and things of that sort, but tracking those people back to the city directories to find out where they are, that's a cop-out. But I just am not able to measure it to that degree. But it's certainly worth noting that there is going to be differences, animosities, people over time who've been here, people who haven't. So it's a very rough measurement, I will agree. Yeah.
Professor, thank you so much for returning to Philadelphia and giving this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
My name is Raina Yancey, and I'm the owner of the Black Journey, a Black History walking tour here in Philadelphia, and we definitely discussed Ona, Judge Staines, and her escape to freedom, her emancipation of herself.
Yeah.
But my question is, did you track perhaps any households and their movements around Philadelphia, perhaps as maybe they moved up or down the socioeconomic ladder, and where they might have moved to?
In physical terms, I can track them in the 1790s, starting to congregate around where they're putting the two churches and moving out that way in physical terms. I've not done an analysis of changing socioeconomic over a decade or something like that. I'm just thinking, I did that long ago with white working class people. It's a great idea. Now you're saying it, it's just a great idea. Yes, because I'm guessing there would be sufficient information. It's similar to what I've got for lower class white people, and especially from tax list to tax list. So thank you very much for that suggestion. Hopefully I'll be here to talk with you again at some point. Yes, ma'am.
Where blacks had to move or were told to move. For example, from around the river to enter Philadelphia,
Yes.
around Master Street, Oxford Street, Jefferson Street. Then when another group of people wanted that area or those houses or those factories, Germantown
Right.
was the next area where black people had to leave. Mount Airy was the next area, which was great for me because I ended up having to follow that track, of course, with my parents, and then further out of the city into the suburbs.
Right.
It was very interesting, yes.
Yeah, but no, that's a really good reminder, too, that African-American people do not have a lot of control in some instances. And even if they're moving, but when they're able to settle in these certain places, establish institutions there, move around them, but then often down the line are just said, sorry, you got to move along. Yes, and so certainly far beyond the control of many of them in those ways. Yes, yeah.
Hey, I hope this isn't an unfair question to ask you. I'm over here.
A disembodied voice.
Yes. But I'm curious to know, since you mentioned it, and I know it's not your specialty, but how did Ona Judge escape slave catchers for so long?
She was helped by the African-American community, for one thing, up in Portsmouth. And I think one of her reasons to choose Portsmouth is she must have known something, because there was an unusually high number of African-Americans who were living in Portsmouth. So she got a number of warnings from people. There were also sympathetic white people up there, too, who were helping him out, like this, customs guy who goes to interview her at George Washington's request. And he sort of warns her at the same time he's interviewing her. So she does have help. And once again, I guess we would talk about the kind of community support that she has both there and as it's furnished in Philadelphia, too.
Did she keep her name, or did she change her name?
She keeps her name. It is pretty amazing. And George knows where she is then. Pretty quickly, they learn where she is. And I was surprised at that as well, is why you wouldn't change your name. And I don't know the answer to that one. Yeah, she seems to stay, if you will, above ground. She gets married. No, that doesn't matter. Go ahead.
Last question. Yep, last question.
Can you tell us who Anne Sayville was? I tried to Google her quickly, and
No, I think that's somebody I've discovered, actually. She's very active in the 1793 yellow fever epidemic. One of the things that African Americans do, and I had that map I skipped over at the very end, is step forward and help save the city. They're the ones who go out and nurse people, who bring water to people, do the essentials, bury people, things of that sort. Anne Seville organizes the hospital that is put up outside the city, which originally when they put this up to take sick people there, it's just a mess. If you go there, you're going to be dead within 6 days, basically. Anne Seville helps take over the nursing and organizes, and then is recognized at the time by doctors saying she's the savior, basically, here. So in that regard, she's helping the community, not just the black community, but the white community too. But if you email with me, I can send more information too.
Great. Well, thank you, Billy, for a provocative and informative talk.
Thank you very much.